Well, welcome everybody to the podcast. And in this episode, we have Mariana Louis, who is an archetypal taroist, whom I love to listen to, as she has so much knowledge and wisdom on mythical, mystical, gnostic, and just anything divinely feminine. Mariana doesn't call this an academy per se, but I believe you have your own academy called Persephone's Sister. You
hmm
can definitely look a bunch of stuff under there and learn, where she hosts workshops, provides archetypal tarot readings for those that are ready to embark on their own individuation journey. And she is hosting right now, currently, a Jungian seminar with the Jung Academy
hmm
about how to properly do shadow work with the cards. So
Yeah.
I'm just really excited to have you here with me today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yes, yes, yes. And the first thing that I wanted to ask is just kind of like, how did you get started on that spiritual path or just diving away from just the regular Catholic church?
Yeah. So I was a very devout Catholic for a long time. Not because my family was, because I found that on my own as like a young person. And then as I got a little bit older, I started having the natural questions that I think any young woman might have about where's the other side of this? Why is it so masculine all the time? And I started having a bit of a spiritual crisis. And I was 23, something like that. And I was in my grandfather's attic. And he was a book collector. And I found Carl Jung's The Undiscovered Self. And I was just kind of fell in love with these ideas immediately of considering the soul and considering what I really think of as Jung's work is like the psychology of soul and how we can better understand that we're all on this path of individuation and we're all on this path of ultimate self-discovery that is at the same time mystical discovery. And so I did research and read a lot about Jung and other spiritual methodologies. And I, at some point, just got a tarot reading. I didn't even purchase one. It wasn't even an intention of mine. I think I was on a yoga retreat and someone brought cards and I was like, okay, why not? I've never had a reading before. And they gave me this reading that was so spot on, of course. And the very last card that was pulled is like the outcome, like for my future, was the High Priestess. And I was just like, okay, interesting. What's this
Ooh.
card? Yeah. I was very intrigued. What does this mean? So, of course, I started reading about the tarot, and it folds so well into Jungian thought and depth psychology and archetypes and all these other things I was interested in. And it just exploded from there. And I went to, I was an actor at the time. That was my profession. And then I took a break from it and went and got my master's degree in Western intellectual traditions. So I was studying patterns of thought in the West, occult philosophy, and all these sorts of things. And it just sort of blossomed into this kind of marriage of depth psychology and archetypal history and just with the tarot holds that all in it. So it just kind of came to be.
Yes, it's so beautiful. And to get the high priestess as the outcome,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, it was pretty significant as the first reading. And it was, it's so interesting to me because some of those cards, whenever I have a client who comes to me and they're like, it's my first reading ever, I'm always like, okay, this is going to be the big one. Because for me, so many of the cards I pulled in that reading, I wish I could remember all of them. But the ones that were like, I'm still working with them to this day, I pulled them in that first reading and they were right, put me right in it. So yeah, it was very meaningful for me.
that's beautiful.
Yeah.
For those of you that may not know that are listening, like what is the path of individuation? Like what
Yeah.
does that term mean?
This is an idea that really comes from Carl Jung. Carl Jung is one of the forefathers of depth psychology. And when we say depth psychology, basically what it means and the way we distinguish it from normal, traditional, contemporary psychology is that depth psychology is particularly interested in the way that the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are in conversation with each other. In more traditional branches of psychology that we use today, a lot of it is on like behaviors and how we think and how we act and it's more kind of based in our conscious selves. And so in depth psychology, we're very interested in what the unconscious has to say, what's going on under the surface of things. So Carl Jung is one of the forefathers of depth psychology, and he came up with this idea that individuation is the perpetual path of coming into one's own unique experience of self. And it's kind of like a little bit mysterious. He calls this the archetype of self, capital S self. And so it is both you and who you are in its most authentic expression. And it is also like the divine image, the thing that is far beyond you and connects you to all things. These are both the same. So the path of individuation is the path of getting ever closer to that capital S self. So for some, it's a very practical path of just like self-realization. And for others, it's a very spiritual path, very mystical path. For me, it certainly is. So that's kind of the way I like to think of individuation.
Yes, and with the cards being such a beautiful way to reflect those things that we're not able to perceive in the
Yeah.
subconscious, it
Yeah.
just makes sense that you have this term of archetypal tarot. So how did
Yep.
that come to be?
Yeah, well, because I had studied so much about Jung and was so well versed in the archetypes and thinking in this way, I mean the cards reflect it so beautifully. And I had done a lot of reading. There's certainly other books out there on Jung and tarot. Like there's people have thought about this before, but no one had quite put it together in the way that it was starting to come together in my brain. And so I took the time and sat there and grappled with like how do all these things overlap. And I really do believe that the tarot in particular, and especially the major arcana, just like so perfectly present what that journey of individuation looks like for us. So whenever we pull cards, it kind of clues us into like where am I here in this journey, like what point am I at. And of course it's all a spiral, it's a cycle, so it's not linear. We don't like start and then end, because that's not human life, right? We're kind of starting and moving forward and moving back and spinning around and getting closer, but always it's a constant journey we're on.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you call it archetypal and that you show that side of it as well. Because for me, for example, when I first got my tarot reading, I was a little spooked out. I'm like, is this going to
Mhm.
be like, are you going to tell me my future? Are you going to tell me when I'm going to die? And it's not fortune telling at all, at least not the way that I've experienced it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, some
Yeah.
people read that way, and that is an amazing talent that some people have to be able to kind of tap in and pull out predictions or insights into the way the world will continue. There's a quote by Mary K. Greer that I love. Mary K. Greer is like a very well-known tarot speaker, tarot teacher. She wrote a lot of books about the tarot, and she says, the only time you'll get an outcome is when you're dead.
Ooh,
And it's like this idea that we're always looking for outcomes in the cards, like what is going to be the thing that happens. And it's never set. Like it's never, this is what is exactly going to happen to you. And there's no variation and there's nothing to learn. This is it, that you're done. I find that actually, for most people, when they go to a tarot reader, they definitely expect it to be, they're going to tell me when I'm going to get married, how many kids I'm going to have, when I'm going to die, right? These things. And if you're going to a good reader or somebody who's a little bit cautious, not to say that predictive reading is bad in any way, it's just a different thing. I think that readers who are more attentive to that work of individuation, to supporting their clients, their querents, we don't want to tell people what's going to happen, because then they feel like they're trapped in those like outcomes and those predictions, and they kind of lose the sense of free will. Instead, the work is entirely to give people or help them see that they already possess the tools they need to know how to live their lives and to make the best choices, the most authentic choices, and to support them by giving them insight about what's going on under the surface in their psyche, in the inner world, so that they feel more in alignment with that. I think so many people are just kind of like, what do I actually want? This is the question we don't always know how to answer. What is it that I actually want? And so a good reading will help you get to that. And that's what you walk away from.
yeah, I get certain people, a lot of people come to me for like love readings, for example.
Yeah,
And that's the hardest one because it's the most emotionally charged.
absolutely.
Yeah. And it's like if you tell me or if you're asking me like, oh, is this person the love of my life? And you have to be with this person because you're gonna learn something from the relationship, or it's gonna
Yeah.
show you an aspect of yourself that you have to heal. Like I'm gonna have to let you know, like, you're supposed to be with this person at this time, you know? So it's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah, I personally, I don't believe that there is such a thing as set fate. I don't believe
yeah.
that there's only one option for us. And I think that we're changing every time we make a choice. It changes every option that's available after that. But love readings are really kind of miserable. Because
I feel
people,
you.
they always want to know, like they always want to be told the thing they want to hear, which is really hard. And of course, it's only half the time what they want to hear is going to be the true thing. Um, but yeah, with these sorts of questions, it's again, it can be really actually difficult to like if you're a reader and someone says, "Is this relationship the one for me?" and you see all these cards of like uncovering old wounds and uncovering, patterns that you need to work through, maybe it'll be the one of your life. But more importantly, it's going to be the one to show you all the stuff you haven't been able to look at about yourself for a really long time. And it's going to be hard, right? And you see that, and no one really wants to hear that. They want to hear everything's going to be perfect and rainbows and butterflies for the rest of life. So just as a general note, I always say that if you're going to go to a reader, try to ask questions that are supportive of you understanding what's going on for you rather than, is this going to happen? Or is this the right thing? Or should I do that? Or is this person always going to stay with me or whatever? And I know we all want to know those things, but it's better to come with like, how do I support myself to know if this is the right thing when it comes along? How do I support myself so that if I need to make a change, I feel like ready and competent to do that when I have that intuitive knowledge that something needs to be different. Those are the ways that the tarot can really, really, really help.
Yeah, and that's the way that it should. Well, not necessarily should, because everybody wants to get something out of it, depending on
Hmm.
their experience, where they're at,
Hmm.
or what they want to do, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like that example of me pulling the High Priestess, the very first reading I had, I didn't, it was really funny. The woman who was reading for me, since we were on a yoga retreat, she was like, "Oh, you want to be a yoga teacher, right?" And I was like, "I don't at all. I have no interest. I like yoga, but it's not my thing for life." And she was like, "Oh, well, because you have the High Priestess, and the High Priestess is like a teacher, and she's like in the spiritual world and everything. So I just assumed that's what you want. And maybe you should go do that, right? Like maybe that's the choice for you." And I was like, really struggled with that for a while because I was like, am I supposed to be a yoga teacher? And I didn't really at that point have any idea what the High Priestess meant for me. I was really just like, I'm not totally happy being an actor, and I really like these like Jung and these ideas, but I don't know what to do with that. And I was just totally open-ended. It wasn't like I had some dream of going off and being the High Priestess in some way. And as time went on, I left that idea, like it was always in the back of my head, but I didn't know where it was going to take me. And as I worked through my degree and all these things, were happening, I remember one day waking up and being like, holy cow, like it was here the whole time. Like I don't know if it planted the seed or if it made the prediction. I wasn't even ready to see what was actually going to happen with it yet. You know, that's more of my like inclination to think that that card was in some way kind of showing me a glimpse of the future of like, this is exactly where you're headed. You don't know how you're going to get there, but have faith that this is what's coming. So, I think that it can be really powerful in that way. And certainly the tarot can work that way sometimes, but we can't grip too hard onto it. Otherwise, we're just trying to make sense of something we can't possibly see yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you are a teacher now. Like, you have your own little workshops
Yeah,
and
yeah. I literally became the high priestess in that I was like working in, occult modalities and working with like the soul and the spirit, and all of it was like exactly where I wanted to go. It wasn't yoga. It was actually something else. But it was the right idea. It was the right thing. She was totally on point with like seeing where it was going to take me, just, a little off in the actual like details, but
yeah.
that's okay.
Yes, yes. I'm very curious because you mentioned that you used to be an actor and that was your profession. And I know that you're also a singer, that you would sing
Yeah.
in the choir at your church. How do you marry that with the master's degree and the education that you have with everything about the psychology and tarot?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I'm still thinking about a lot because so I was a musical theater performer, and I was doing a lot of like touring, and I was working in a lot of theaters like across the country. And I think that what I learned a lot was that, that was a very extroverted life. And my calling was very much an introverted life. I'm a natural introvert, but also when we think of the introverted life, it's like the idea that our meaning is derived from what we discover within ourselves rather than meaning being derived from like what happens outside of ourselves. And making that shift was really important for me to honor my natural state of like where I feel most at home in myself. But I'm constantly, pulling in these ideas of like, you know, storytelling and story making with the cards and how the stories unfold and how we are kind of like a little bit removed from it and watching it and trying to piece it together and find ourselves in it. As you said, I'm doing this workshop right now about shadow and the tarot and how to do shadow work in a more like educated way, appropriate way. And someone asked me recently how music can be part of this. And I was like, oh, I've never thought about it before. And it came to me that like one of the things that music can do, which is so interesting, is that it really, really removes us from the analytical mind and drops us into this more archetypal state of like just being with feeling. Just like we can hear a piece of music and somehow we know it's sad. We know it's sad. We can feel the sadness of the composer because there's something about the quality of it that we can't, like, we can try to analyze it, but it's not really something we can analyze. We just feel it. And I think that using music for sure can kind of put us in the right state of presence, to prepare us for what we might do if we're doing shadow work with the tarot or we're just going to do a reading. So those are things I'm still exploring, but it's something I'm very interested in right now of seeing how I can blend those two things more.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting that you bring up the fact that music can help with the emotions, like the sadness,
Yeah.
because that's something that I've thought about well, unconsciously. Like I'll do that. I feel like it's hard for me to cry, and that's its own thing.
Yeah.
But whenever I want to try to like cry, I try to put like a movie that's sad or put music that's a little bit like more in my feelings so I can open myself up to let myself
Yeah.
cry.
Yes.
So that's a beautiful way to work with those emotions that are a little bit harder for me to access.
Yeah, yeah, I think, and it's really like intuitively smart of you to do that because I think that'll, having trouble accessing feeling is something a lot of us struggle with, especially in our society, which is so focused on the intellect and
Yeah.
like being rational. And it's sometimes very hard to drop into like, what do we feel? What do we feel? And we know, yeah, I don't feel great underneath things. Like I know that, but how do I actually feel it? And music has such a power to, I really think it just taps us into the archetypal experience of just, removing the brain, removing the intellect. It moves us. And when we're moved, we know that there's an archetype going on. There's some kind of archetypal thing happening under the surface. And I do the same thing whenever I know like I need to cry or I need to get something out. I know exactly the music I'm going to put on and I'm just going to sit there and wait and it'll do its work. It'll work at some point. So I think it's a good way of getting out of the analytical brain.
Yeah, it's like a language of the soul, like the
Yeah.
soul recognizes the music.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Beautifully said.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I remember that you've mentioned too the undiscovered self,
Hmm.
and that you just went over that in the book club that you have
Yeah.
alongside Christina. Yes. And that was one of your grandfather's books.
Yeah. My grandfather.
Mm,
Hmm.
yes, and his little collection of the psychology stuff that he never shared.
Yeah, he had like 8,000 books. This is my task right now as the one granddaughter who cares about books. I'm like sorting I'm sorting through all the books he left. Most of them are on like Russian politics, and they're just very
Oh,
random. Yeah, he had really weird interests. But I just found one day this like random bookshelf in the back with just pretty much every book that I have by Jung or Jungian thinkers I got from him because he just had such a beautifully wonderful collection. So I was very lucky. It feels like almost like destiny in a way that he had this like little stash and no one had touched it and no one had seen it for like 20, 30 years. And I just was rummaging around looking for something interesting to read and found this. So I really do believe that that was like kismet. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because from
Yeah.
then on, you were able to just continue and flourish into everything that you know today and
Yeah.
everything else that you've been able to put together.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
Yes,
grateful for that.
very, very. I'm grateful too.
Yeah, very sweet.
With the other thing too that I wanted to share is I don't hear a lot of women, if I'm being honest, because I've
Hmm.
heard men talk about it, like William Henry, for example, talk about Gnosticism and Mary
Hmm.
Magdalene and maybe the Sophia. And I think you, aside from Kaya Ra, you're the second person that I've heard talk about the divine feminine aspect of Christianity,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
is, yeah. So would you care to,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm very passionate about it. I think that, Gnosticism is something that we've known about for a long time. It's not something that is like new to us. Talking about the divine feminine is certainly like a newer conversation we've had in maybe the last like 100 years. Gnosticism is, for those who don't haven't heard about it before, it's basically this branch of Christian thinking that broke off from the way the church ended up developing in pretty much right after Jesus died. There's like kind of this division. And the Gnostic way of thinking is far more mystical and mythological and weird and very interesting. And in it, there is this figure, Sophia, and Sophia is a core figure of Gnosticism. She was what they called an aeon, which is a sort of like an angel. And there's this. I can't get into the whole story, but there's a very interesting story about how she births the demiurge, which is sort of like the devil, and all this stuff. But basically, the way that we think of Sophia and the book of wisdom of the Bible, a lot of Gnostic scholars say that this is like the book of Sophia, basically, is she is the goddess of wisdom. She is also associated with Shekinah, who is the kind of in more ancient Judaism, she is sort of the feminine aspect of the divine. And so Sophia is equated to her a lot too. And so this has been there for thousands of years. It's just been buried under the surface of things. It's with um, with the rise of patriarchy in society, which has really been like about some people say 3,000 years, 5,000 years that patriarchy has really been developing in the world. Um, the the At the same time, there's been this repression of the divine feminine because in order for patriarchy to have any kind of hold in the world, in order for it to have its hierarchy, its opposite, the feminine, has to be suppressed to assert
exactly.
its dominance. Yeah. So the biggest way that the patriarchy will be challenged is not actually, in my opinion, is not actually through women having political power as much as it is spiritual power. Because if God cannot look like a woman, then there is nothing sacred about woman, right? If God can only look like a man and only be masculine, then that is all that is holy and divine. And so I believe that that's the greatest way that patriarchy and the sexism in patriarchy has taken hold and still has hold is very much in the way that the feminine has been divorced from any kind of divinity. And so this is the work I think that many divine feminine scholars, I call myself a sacred feminist because that's kind of the way I like to think about it.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, I'm feminist, but it's really, really based in the sacred reclamation of what is feminism there. And I really believe that our work for anybody who's interested in the divine feminine and bringing it more consciously back in the world, it's not only about like, I want to embrace what femininity is to me and I want to own that. That's all really beautiful and that's part of it. But it's also about like being very vocal and very clear about how you can reclaim the divine aspect of the feminine and see God or spirit or whatever it is that you call it, seeing the feminine side of it. And then in seeing that, sharing that and helping other people find it and passing it on to our children or whatever, however it kind of passes through you. That is something that I find to be one of the greatest ways that we can actually make change in the world. I'm very passionate about it because this is also why we have the climate crisis and all these things. It's because a big part of that, part of patriarchy, is domination of the feminine, and we have always equated archetypally the earth with Mother Nature, with the feminine. And so the domination of earth is very much this sort of like expression of this like patriarchal domination of the feminine. So, if we can reclaim the holiness and the sacredness of the feminine, then that will instinctually, some of these really, really enormous dangers that we have in the world will start to shift and reconcile themselves. And that's at least the hope I have. The fool's hope, maybe, but the hope. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too is just the very beginning is to bring awareness to all of this
Yeah.
because I don't think growing up I heard about Mary Magdalene
Hmm.
a lot, right? And that's honestly like what kind of had me go down this rabbit hole because I got the book Magdalene Mysteries and
Hmm.
it answered so many questions that I had that I didn't even know that I had. And I was like, oh my God, like all of these are the questions that my little 8-year-old self had when I would go to church and I would hear about Mary Magdalene, and
Yeah.
she's a prostitute, but yet she's
Yeah.
mentioned and she's very important. And it's just like there has to be more to the picture than this, and they're not telling me, and I'm not like brave enough to ask, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, she was the only one who witnessed the resurrection. And
Exactly.
that's, like that little tiny detail they just love to just pass over. And it's yet if Jesus resurrected, out of all the people in the world to resurrect for, why
Mhm.
only her? And why that? And they don't like to talk about it. But I think that these little details, it's really good to pick up on because, like as you said, there's so much to Mary Magdalene that has come to light in the last like 100 years because they found some texts, some scrolls that are mention her and associated with her, that kind of very much question the story that the church has always gone with about her role and all this stuff. So I'm reading right now The Madonna Secret. Have you heard of this book?
I heard of it and I started to try to listen, but I need to get the physical book to start reading it
It's
instead.
long. Yeah, it's hard to focus. Yeah, so I'm about halfway through and it's really delightful. And it's just like this beautiful like novel, just kind of imagining what this relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus would have looked like. And it's
Oh,
very sweet. Highly recommend.
yes, I know that it's Sophia Clark that's the one that wrote it, and her parents are the one that wrote the book The
Yeah.
Way of the Rose.
Yeah, Sophie Strand. Sophia Strand.
Yes, there you
Yeah.
go. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, her parents wrote The Way of the Rose, so she's like well versed in this idea of the feminine and Christianity. So she's definitely an expert on that stuff.
Yes, 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 yes. So with the whole bringing up of everything that's resurfacing about Mary Magdalene and just about Mary in general and the relationship of the feminine with Jesus outside of what was said, with the canonical law and the texts that were approved under the canonical law versus the
Yeah.
ones that are not approved or not listed. Anyways, like how can you, or what would be something that you would advise the people? Because I do have listeners that are in that path of like Catholicism breaking away and like coming back and
Yeah.
trying to understand this relationship. So
Yeah.
what would you think would be a good advice to like first start learning a little bit about this Gnostic side of Christianity?
Yeah. Um, it's a really tough thing. I feel like, especially when you're in a religion that has like clear rules about like how we see things, it's really hard to start questioning them and to start opening up to like other possibilities. So first of all, just honoring that and how tough that is. I don't consider myself a Christian or a Catholic anymore because I'm just too open to whatever might be whatever, but I still am fascinated with these figures and I still so much appreciate the like way the influence that they've had on my life and the teachings that they've offered and how much they've changed me. I think that for Mary Magdalene, I had the like extreme like gift of being able to do a pilgrimage this summer where I followed her footsteps and like went to see all the holy places she preached at in France and like where her boat landed in France and the cave that she died in and like all these. It was so wild and
That must have
amazing.
been amazing.
It was pretty profound, and it's something that not everyone's going to be able to do, for sure.
Mm.
But hey, if you ever get to go to France and you get to go to Provence, I highly recommend at least going to see like the cave that she died in because it's just so moving.
Oh my gosh, she died in a cave?
Yeah, she
Wow.
do you know the story of how she came to France? Do you know that part of her story?
I heard that Pontius Pilate helped her escape to France.
Right, yeah. So,
Yeah.
it's so interesting because this part of the story is so little known, and I only learned about all the details of it because I went to France where they are talking about it all the time, and it's like just part of their like mythology there. So basically after Mary Magdalene, after Jesus died and there was all this, the Christians were being hunted and persecuted and everything, Mary Magdalene was sent away, like she was basically sent off to die at sea. And the story is that she was put on a rudderless boat. So she and her closest followers were just put on a boat and they were going to drift at sea until they died. And of course, there was a miracle, and she was brought to the southern coast of France. More likely, someone did help her escape and just put her on a boat, and she sailed across the Mediterranean and landed in France. And then the story goes that she was there, and the people there, Romans were already there because Rome, already was in France and everything. And so she was still in hiding and still trying to escape persecution. But the people there like really fell in love with her and really saw her as a teacher. And she preached at all these sacred sites. And like it was from her and Lazarus, her brother Lazarus, who came with her, that they established like the Catholic faith in France. And she went up to this mountain called Mount Saint Baume. Um, and she spent like something like 30 years there in prayer and contemplation. And people would come to her and she'd pass on teachings or whatever. And she this they say that she was kind of like brought up to heaven by the angels or something while she was on that mountain. But anyway, her bones are in a church in a little town called Saint Maximin. I think it's called that, in Provence. And I got to see her bones there and her remains there. And they actually did some testing on them recently, and they found that they fit like the time period, and the like DNA is from the right area, and like so it may be, I don't know. But
Wow.
yeah, it's all very, very interesting.
You
um
saying that actually reminded me that so I grew up in Puerto Rico in a Catholic church,
mhm.
and they do talk about Mary Magdalene being raised to heaven in her full body.
Yeah,
And that's the reason why I was like, how is she mentioned this much and she's just a prostitute and that's it? Like,
yeah.
there's no way that Jesus resurrected in front of her and she was brought up to heaven in her full body if she's not at least like if she's not holy. Like, there's something more to the picture.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
I think that one place to start is like reading some of these books. One of the great one is by Cynthia Bourgeault. And it's on my shelf here. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's Magdalene something. Um,
The
I think
Magdalene Manuscript?
no, it's
No.
where is it? Which one is it? I can't, it's lost in my bookshelf of 10,000 books of stuff.
Who was the author?
Cynthia Bourgeault. Oh, it's The Meaning of Mary Magdalene.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yes. So The Meaning of Mary Magdalene, that's a really good one to read. Cynthia Bourgeault is like the premier kind of contemporary scholar on Mary Magdalene. And she's also a Catholic. So she does come at it with like, how do we take the stories about her and make sense of that in the Catholic faith? And it's trying to actually make meaning. You can definitely read Mary's Gospel, which is part of the Gnostic canon that's out there. I think her gospel was discovered in the late 19th century in Egypt somewhere. And there's all this like whole entire story about how like it was gonna get translated and get published, but then there was like a pipe burst in the publishing house, and then the guy who had the manuscript died, and there's like all these like things that happened to prevent it from getting published. And some people think it's like because they something wants to keep it a secret. But it was published in, I don't know, like something like 70 years later or something like that after it was discovered. And basically it is not a complete gospel, unfortunately. There's missing pages, but there is this Gospel of Mary in which she says these are the lessons I took from Christ and the lessons that he only gave me. And so she has these spiritual lessons that are really profound and have to deal with, understanding shadow and the inner heaven and all these really beautiful things. So I definitely recommend that. They talk about it in The Meaning of Mary Magdalene too, kind of breaking it down. Um, and there's just not a lot about Mary Magdalene that's extremely easy and accessible yet, but it's getting there. We're getting there. So I hope to put together a little video on YouTube about Mary Magdalene in the next couple months, to definitely give people a jumping off point to understanding her and how to work with her. Um, and yeah, have you heard of the Gospel of the Beloved Companion?
I do. I have it actually in my bookshelf.
Yeah, that's wild. So if you really want to dive in down the rabbit hole and get into some wacky, extraordinary stuff, there is supposedly this gospel called the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, which is written by Mary, which has been in the possession of this secret group of this French lineage, basically, that have been in possession of this gospel for centuries, and have refused to let anybody see it. And finally, one person who's part of this lineage got permission to publish it and share it. So it's not like fact checked, like no one else has seen it. They have not allowed like biblical scholars to come and examine it or test it or do any of these things because it is too secret and too sacred. So, but it's pretty amazing. And it is a pretty extraordinary text. So highly recommend checking that out too if you really want to dive in.
Well, I'm gonna have to get back into that one because so lately I've been listening to quantum spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
a book that just came out, I believe, and he talks about the Gnostic text, and he's referencing the author the story of Sophia and how the creation came about and how she was one of the Eternals or the Aeons that
Yep.
you mentioned, and
Yep.
how she wanted to do things her own way with her own
Yeah.
will, and then
Yeah.
that created the reality that we're in today. Um, which is interesting because all of this came from Gnostic texts that were found more recently than earlier, that were hidden in a vase in
Yeah.
Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and then they were like broken and whatever.
Yeah, the Nag Hammadi scrolls. Mm-hmm.
Yes, 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 yes. Um, so yeah, I was listening to that, but I'm gonna have to start just reading both. I want to
Yeah,
just absorb it all.
I know. And it's hard because it's not, so many of these things out there, they're just translations, right? And it's really
Yeah,
hard to read some random translation of something written in Greek or Aramaic from 2000 years ago and get what it's trying to say. Like we need people to first sit with the texts and give us a more just approachable way of understanding them.
yeah,
And there's not a lot of work yet about that out there. I have faith that these things are going to start to emerge and we're going to get more books that are like, here's a way to understand this, and not just like, here's an ancient gospel that is extremely hard to understand. A lot of these Gnostic texts, there's like with Gnosticism, there's a lot of bias against Gnosticism and
yeah,
having a Gnostic approach in things because it's seen as, to some, it's seen as just like blatantly evil and bad. And to others, it's kind of fetishized a little bit. And it's like, oh, and anything Gnostic is like extremely magical or, there's kind of two sides of it. And not the Gnostic work has just, there's so much to take out of it symbolically. There's so much there. And I just love just collecting these stories and sitting with them, meditating on them, and seeing all the extremely like mystical stuff that they were thinking about back then that wasn't based in like orthodoxy and like fact and like this happened or this didn't happen. It's just like, what does this mean? Like, what does this mean
yeah.
for us? Like, how does this make us better people? And how does this make us closer to spirit? And it's just so rich for all of that kind of reflection.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And just also listening to different translations or versions
Yes.
of the story too, because that can give
Yes.
you a bigger window.
Oh yeah, that is a really great exercise of just like trying out different people's. Um I like to kind of I'll find one of the a Gnostic story or hear about it or whatever, and I'll just go on YouTube and like watch like 5 or 6 different videos of people like have read it or retellings of it or interpretations of it. And I'll just kind of deep dive in one of these like every couple of months and just like absorb it as much as I can.
Yes, yes, yes. Oh, I'm loving all of this.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share for people that are trying to redefine their relationship with Gnosticism or even just tarot and all? Because
Yeah.
I feel like all of this, in a way, goes back to who you see yourself as and who you want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it's not always easy to start a journey like this because it feels overwhelming, right? There's so much
Yeah.
to learn. I think that's something that was like if I could go back and tell my 23-year-old self who found the undiscovered self in my grandpa's attic, I remember reading it and thinking, I want to learn everything. I want to know everything. Where did he get all of these ideas? Like all these things he's referenced. Where do I know more? And I remember being so thirsty for it and feeling kind of hopeless because it was like, I'm never going to be able to read all of this stuff and learn all of this stuff. And now being like a decade later, I can reflect on it and look at like, oh my God, I've learned so much stuff in all of this time because I continue to ask questions and to just do research. And so I always tell people, don't get overwhelmed by the fact that there's this thirst to learn and learn and learn. You will learn anytime you have a question, you will learn. So first of all, just be patient that you are absorbing more than you think you are. And I think that with the tarot in particular, I really encourage people to, if you have never bought a deck, you haven't tried it, try it and really, come to it not with like an expectation that you're going to get clear answers about what to do with your life. You're certainly in the first like 2 months of working with tarot, you're going to feel very, very confused because they're all new things. It's a new language, right? Like when you learn any new language, it's going to take some time to get familiar with it. But once you do, like using it as a tool to just ask yourself questions you wouldn't have thought to ask yourself, to say, I'm feeling really tense lately. What's coming up? And pull a card that you didn't expect and let that be an invitation to have a new curiosity about yourself that leads you down some path of self-discovery you would not have gone down otherwise. I think it can be so useful for that. So we use it lightly, like meaning that we're not like putting all this weight every time you pull a card. It has to tell your future and you have to get it perfectly. Like we're just exploring, we're using it to explore. And it's the same thing with like exploring Gnosticism or Mary Magdalene or any kind of mystical path. The idea is always to learn the truths that you're already in possession of. And these are just ways of inspiring different questions that get you closer to the knowledge you're already in possession of. So yeah, that took me a long time to learn. I very much, projected that everywhere. And it was like, someone has the answers. I need to find the person that has the answers and get them from that guy. And I'm finally in the state of being like, oh wait, I've had these since I was probably like 16. I think I thought this. And now I can kind of return to it and approach it with more grace and faith and say, I'm just learning how to trust myself, to trust my own intuition and my own wisdom. That's always ultimately the point, I think.
Yes, it's beautiful how you worded that to just learn deeper about what you know
Yeah,
already.
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Hmm. Yep.
And where can people find you if they want to work with you or take a class with you?
Yeah. So I am at persephonessister.com. I'm also Persephone Sister on Instagram. And if you want to check out a class or anything that I teach, you can definitely go to persephonesister.com and there's all the info there. Um, I also have the Sora Mystica podcast with Christina, we mentioned before. And that's a really great project where we explore the symbols of that we just encounter, in life, in our stories and in our dreams, etc. So we definitely mentioned Gnostic things and mythological things and astrology and all these pathways of discovery. So definitely check out Sora Mystica. Um, and yeah, I hope to connect with people.
Yes, I highly, highly recommend that podcast. I don't miss an episode myself.
Oh, thank
I
you.
love it so much. Yes. And then you guys also, just to just keep going, you guys also have the cloister.
Oh yeah, we have the
Uh,
cloister. Yeah, that's brand new, so it's like something I keep forgetting to talk about. The cloister is like we're building this community that are of listeners for the podcast and also just people who are really interested in exploring the symbolic. So it's we have a chat room for dreams where we share our dreams and get other people's interpretations and input. And we have now this book club, as you mentioned before. We just read The Undiscovered Self. That was our first book. And so that's really exciting to me because we always in the podcast kind of start off by saying what we're reading. And so now we can like talk about the things we're reading with other people and not just ourselves. And so we're very, very thrilled for that. And yeah, and we also have a bonus podcast that we share there too, like shorter episodes, but we get into more kind of interesting, juicy niche things. So our most recent one was on like how to interpret beasts in our dreams and does it mean when we encounter a beast in our dreams. So that's really, really fun.
yeah, so for those of you that are interested or just curious, go ahead and look up the show notes where we'll have all the information. And thank you for everybody that listens. And until next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.